Let's continue doing triangle and identity problems. This time we're going to do some that are on the coordinate plane. So reminder, our steps are to draw a triangle, label your sides with words and numbers, find the third side with the Pythagorean theorem. New step, or reminder from old tests, is now we have to determine the signs, plus or minus signs, based on how it's oriented in the coordinate plane. And then the new step for this test is now we're going to write out our identities and use identities to come up with our SOHCAHTOA fractions. Here are the identities. The first example, we'll use the double angle identities for sine, cosine, and tangent. And the next two examples are going to use the sum and difference identities. Let me mention for the sum and difference identities, they're often written with a plus or minus sign here. If it's a plus, then you want to add between here. If it's a minus, you want to subtract between here. And for cosine, if it's a plus, you subtract. If it's a minus, you add. Okay, let's do our first example with double angle identities. Given that tan theta equals square root 15 in quadrant 3, determine the exact values for sine 2 theta, cosine 2 theta, and tan 2 theta. We'll get to this last quadrant question later. All right, let's draw our triangle in the third quadrant, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then remember your triangles go against the x-axis and your angle goes against the x-axis. So my opposite side, my adjacent side is the x-axis, and my hypotenuse is this slanted side that's drawn. Tan, I can write square root 15 over 1, so I can quickly see the TOA fraction. My opposite side is square root 15, and my adjacent side is 1. Find your, step 3, find your third side using the Pythagorean theorem, and then we'll deal with plus and minus signs. Okay, so Pythagorean theorem, 1 squared plus square root 15 squared equals, remember c squared has to be your hypotenuse. You should be able to do this by now, and you should be able to figure out that the hypotenuse is 4. Let's determine our plus or minus signs, and then we'll get to our identities. So from the origin here, I have to go backwards and down to get to my tip of my triangle. Backwards is a negative direction, down is a negative direction, and the hypotenuse is always positive. All right, now we're ready to figure out what sine 2 theta, cosine 2 theta, and tan 2 theta are. Sine 2 theta, the identity or formula here is 2 times sine theta times cosine theta. So we're going to replace sine and theta and cosine theta with their SO and CA fractions. So the opposite side is negative square root 15. The hypotenuse is 4. CA, the adjacent side is negative 1. The hypotenuse is 4. If you need to write 2 over 1, so you have lots of fractions and it's very in your face of what we're doing, multiply all your numbers across on top. The 2 and the 1 are outside of the square root, so they stay outside of the square root. 2 times 1. The 15 is underneath the square root, so it needs to stay underneath the square root. And double negatives multiply to be positive. And multiply across the bottom. 1 times 4 is 16. If you can simplify your fraction, which means simplify the numbers that aren't part of the square root, then simplify them. And so my final answer here, the sine 2 theta fraction is square root 15 over 8. Positive square root 15 over 8. Now we can find the cosine 2 theta fraction. We can use any of these cosine 2 theta identities. I prefer to use the first one, but you can honestly use whatever you want to, any of these three. So cosine 2 theta is cosine squared theta minus sine squared theta. Replace cosine theta with the CA fraction. Replace sine theta with the SO fraction. So that means we will have negative 1/4 squared minus negative square root 15/4 squared. All right, square everything. Negative 1 squared is positive 1. 4 squared is 16. Negative square root 15 squared is positive 15. 4 squared is 16. So 1/16 minus 15/16 is negative 14/16, or what's that? Negative 7/8. And then last, to find our tan 2 theta value, tangent of any angle is the sine value of that angle over the cosine value of, that needs to be a 2, that angle. So I can take square root 15/8 and divide it by -7/8. When you have double fractions like this, write it as top divided by bottom. And keep, change, flip. So keep the first fraction the same, change division to multiplying, and flip. My 8's cancel out, so my tangent fraction is square root 15/7. You can keep the negative with the 7, you can put it on top, or you can just put it somewhere out front, but this is a negative fraction.